Behind me is the Penelope Barker House in Edenton, North Carolina. This was the scene of what is called the Edenton Tea Party, when a number of women living in and around Edenton uh, in the years before the War for American Independence um, got together and petitioned the King of Great Britain and his ministers for redress of grievances, particularly taxation without representation and similar issues. Most of us have never heard of the Edenton Tea Party. Nearly all of us have heard of the Boston Tea Party. Even if we don't know any of the details, we know that it occurred, and it occurred specifically in December of 1773. Now, why is this? Well, for a long time, um, historians and in the 19th century and much of the 20th century, we're talking primarily about white male historians, only thought of other white males, and particularly elite white males, you know, those with property, those with political prominence, um, you know, generals, um, politicians, major businessmen, and so forth. There was a sense that only these men were worth studying. Ordinary white men or African American men or Hispanic men or whatever weren't considered, worthy of study at all. Why would you do this? They didn't really do anything. Well, they did a lot, but it was at the level of what we call social history. And as for women, even once these white male historians began to get interested in the social history of ordinary men. It was really ordinary men. It wasn't ordinary people. They didn't really study women very much, and so this is one reason why you get the Boston Tea Party so much in the foreground, and the Edenton Tea Party, so far in the rear that you don't really even know that it occurred. Um, and indeed, this is because you're talking about the history of women. And when uh, a pioneering historian of women went to her dissertation advisor and said, "I'd like to do my dissertation on women," she was told in no uncertain terms that this was a loser and that she would never get a job if she pursued women's history. And yet she did. She did her dissertation on women's history, and she became a pioneer in women's history and helped to establish the first women's studies programs in this country, and ultimately um, women's studies departments in this country. And again, her name is Gerda Lerner, and it is a name well worth remembering. Okay, I'm going to share the screen with you in just a moment. I want to make sure of something right quick. Okay, now I'm ready to share the screen with you. It's always such a cumbersome process. I do it all the time, and I still can't get used to it very well. Okay, when I teach um, American, when I used to teach in a regular classroom, particularly, I would always put up on the as the first PowerPoint slide the name of the course and the name of the professor, in case some student walked in and wasn't sure of the course, or walked in and accidentally hit the wrong, came into the wrong course or whatever. It isn't necessary, obviously, on an online course, but supposing that I placed, this slide, first on it to begin with, it would give you an impression about what American history, how I was going to teach it, or what American history is really all about. And this is a somewhat allegorical illustration, and the banner that the eagle is holding says, "Under my wings, everything prospers." And so, what we're talking about here is a prominent theme in American history, that of abundance, that of opportunity, that of possibility. So we'll begin with that, with this particular image. with what is, with what something in mind, and that is this image is also a statement that has political implications. Okay, and let's get into that in a bit. First, I want you to look at the key terms for this lecture. I call it the politics of history. You'll find these terms on the PDF of this lecture presentation that precedes this video presentation, so I won't spend too much time with them. Let's move on. What is at stake when it comes to these politics of history? Well, George Orwell, in his novel 1984, put it this way. It's a very famous quote. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. And so the idea is people have, society has a memory of how things used to be. And if you control the present, the more absolutely you control the present. What gets taught in schools, what exhibits you find in museums, what places like the Penelope Barker House, get preserved, then you control the way in which people remember their own history and what they don't know about their own history. So in 1984, the English Socialist Party, INGSOC, is in charge of an area called Oceania, which basically corresponds to England, North America, and Australia. And this is a totalitarian regime. George Orwell is critiquing totalitarianism, and this is one of their mottos, the English Socialist Party's mottos. And the idea is um, they have complete control over the past, to the point where if a newspaper article from the recent past doesn't correspond any longer with the propaganda or the worldview that the English Socialist Party wants to present, that newspaper is redone. The old one is thrown away, and the new one is redone in accordance uh, with what the party wants people to know. And so the person, and so this means if you understand what has happened, so on, then you have the ability to control the future, what people think is going to happen. People think what is normal, the trajectory of events in the past, and those who control the present control the past, controls what has a history, controls what does not have a history. Now, you might suppose that sound history would be objective, kind of a just the facts man, to quote from Dragnet, which is a TV show from way, way before your time. The idea that you can do a history that is um, politically neutral. Well, this is an impossibility. A guy named Peter Novick wrote a famous book about it called That Noble Dream, the objectivity question in the American historical profession. And what he said is that what historians can aspire to is history that is objective, history in which they take their own personal political views or their ideas about how things ought to be and so forth and set them to the sideline as much as possible, and try to present history in an authentic uh, kind of way. The problem is, he concluded, and pretty much all historians have concluded at this point, is that you can't be objective. Why is this? Well, you have a worldview, first of all, that you bring to the table, so that the white male historians that I talked about a few minutes ago, it wasn't so much that they consciously thought about, well, women have a history too, and let's reject that history. It was that it just didn't occur to them that women had a history. And so their worldview excluded women from the possibility of having a history, just as their worldview excluded the idea that African Americans or Hispanics or ordinary men and women of whatever race had a history. That was their worldview. So there are lots of things that they excluded without even thinking about it. And then of the things that they chose to deal with, they had to deal. There was a question of the selection and weighting of facts. What was most important to be known, and what were and how much weight would you give to the facts to support that, that argument or that thing that was most important to know? And so, for all of these reasons, objectivity is impossible. It is something we can aspire to, but it is not something that we can ultimately achieve. Now, this is an image from the recent American past, and it's a protest against the revision of the Florida Advanced Placement African American History course, which was basically stripped of much reference to the enslavement of African Americans. It sort of accentuated the positive, and by positive I mean what was positive for the predominantly white middle class audience. But you would have seen back in 1970 on the Ohio State campus, you would have seen um, protests very much like this, because there's a huge student strike in 1970 with as many as 100,000 people on the oval of the Ohio State. So a lot of Ohio State students, and then a lot of people from outside Ohio State who had a kind of an interest in what was going on. And among the things that were protested during this student strike was a demand for the inclusion of African American and African studies, women's studies, and so on. And so this is when African and African American studies began at Ohio State University, when you began to see the first courses in women's history and so on. And so it required a political movement, protests and so forth, to shift the politics of history away from the emphasis on white male elites to include other people. And these other people were not just women and African Americans. They were also ordinary men, in the case of American history, ordinary American men, who were laborers and so on, and then including other groups back then called the American Indians, what would now be called Native Americans or indigenous people. A more inclusive kind of history. So, now, I want to introduce the distinction between history and public memory, or the idea of, put it this way, the idea of history as something to go back and look at, critically, and see sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, with the idea of being able to learn from that historical past. And then there is something called public memory. Another way to put it is this is a celebratory history that is primarily about telling a story about our society in the way that we want to view our society as being. And let me give you a sense of the distinction between the two. With regard to history, it's okay to argue about historical personalities, events, concepts, and so on. Uh, for example, should Robert E. Lee have ordered Pickett's charge on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg? I don't know what successfully is doing in there. Should Robert E. Lee have ordered Pickett's charge on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg? And as many of you know, he did launch Pickett's charge against the center of the Union line on the third and final day of the battle. Uh, the attack was a great disaster for the Confederates, helped to result in the destruction of about a third of Lee's army in terms of dead, wounded, and captured. And so historians have, ever since it happened, first veterans of the conflict and then historians of the conflict have argued about, whether Robert E. Lee should have done this or not. But with regard to public memory, it isn't okay to challenge a society's dominant accepted view of historical personalities, events, and so on. So that the idea that the U.S. Civil War was caused by the desire of white Southerners to protect the institution of slavery, although it is obvious from the ordinances of secession that the seceding Southern states passed and the documents in which they supported their decision and the arguments that they made to other Southern states who had not yet seceded to say, you should join us, you should secede as well, all focused on slavery, on the protection of slavery. But after the Civil War, this very quickly became an uncomfortable memory. And so it got shifted to something else. And the most prominent one was um, states' rights. And the argument became not that some Americans were fighting to preserve slavery and other Americans wound up fighting to destroy slavery, but rather um, Americans fought for different but morally equivalent visions of the American Republic, the American um, Republican future. And so both sides were valorous and both sides uh, fought for worthy causes. So that became the dominant public memory for a long time. And I'll get to why that was in a moment. But let's go back and look at that original screen again. So this, if you were to walk into the classroom for that first day of school, and you were to read this banner, "Under my wings, everything prospers," what you would expect from me as the instructor would be that I was going to be generating a positive American history, as it were, um, on the basis on with the basic theme of abundance, with the basic theme of growth, the basic theme, as the banner says explicitly, America as a prosperous country. Um, so, but supposing that you walked in and saw this, well, this is also a positive vision of American history, but notice what it emphasizes. It emphasizes political history, first of all. It emphasizes the founders. And, the theme here really is one of a nobility in terms of the creation of a republic based on freedom and equality and all the things, the positive things that we associate with the founders. Supposing that I put this slide up as the first one, well, you might think, well, this is first of all, what is this attack of the 50-foot woman doing here? But in fact, you might quickly realize, oh, she's an allegorical figure, and she's Columbia, which is often a symbol for the United States, and she is holding in her left hand um, a cable or a wire, and this wire is a telegraph wire. And behind her, you see trains moving to the west, and you see farmers moving to the west, stagecoaches moving to the west, settlers moving to the west. And if you look at the left side, toward the top, you see the American bison, retreating to the west or running to the west or whatever. And the same thing with Native Americans, who are viewed here as as sort of savage and not as legitimate claimants to the land. And before about 1970, this was actually a pretty dominant view of relationships between whites and American Indians. Whites were considered to be superior to American Indians. American Indians might be considered like noble savages, and you saw that. But in terms of movie depictions and television and depictions on TV, this was the dominant theme. And it was only about 1970 that the rise of the American Indian movement, a political movement, began to place on the landscape that the idea that, hey, you know, American Indians, we, first of all, we're still here. And secondly, we're not the caricature that you want to think of us as being. And we have a society, we have political aspirations. We are a group that is, as a society, is impoverished and to some extent, stuck on Native American reservations, and this is wrong and needs to be changed. And so at this point, around circa 1970, you begin to see a change in the view of Native Americans or indigenous people. Well, supposing that I put this on. Well, here, this is an extended African American family. This photograph was taken on the Sea Islands of South Carolina during the American Civil War. And these are people who are still legally actually enslaved, but their owners have fled in the face of the Union Army, and a photographer has come down here and has taken a photograph of them. And what you couldn't miss in this particular photograph would be that American history, an important part of American history, was the enslavement of African Americans. And, many Americans of whatever race understand that there was enslavement and that it was bad, and that when freedom came, the recently freed population called freed people um, were were behind in the sense that they had not had the opportunity for education. In much of the South, it was illegal to teach African Americans, enslaved or free, to read and write, or to teach them basic mathematics, and so on. And then after the American Civil War, there was a concerted attempt to keep this force that was no longer, or keep these people, although they were no longer enslaved, to keep them as a labor force that um, had little ability to go from one employer to the other, that had little ability to own property for themselves, and so on. And this, incidentally, is part of my own family history. On one side of my history, and you'll see this in a bit, um, my great grandfather was lived through the American Civil War and Reconstruction. At the end of the American Civil War, had about 20 African Americans living on his property, and the Union Army came through and required both those 20 African Americans and my great grandfather to sign a 1 year contract. Nobody had any choice in this. A 1 year contract in which you know, my great grandfather was no longer an owner, but he was an employer. And the 20 people working on had been his plantation were no longer slaves, where they were employees. And since my great grandfather did not have much in the way of money to pay them, the army said, what the African Americans are going to do, the freed people are going to do, is they are going to labor, they are going to produce the crop, and it goes to you partly, and then they keep part of it, and you can sell your part of it, Mr. Harvin, that was his last name, Mr. Harvin, you know, and they can sell part of it, and they can live on on what was the plantation, rent free. And so this is the historical reality that underpins this particular photograph. And you could expect a course based upon this to deal very heavily with issues of slavery and racism and so forth. And you could walk into the class and you could either think, well, of course there's going to be in the first half of an American history course an emphasis on, on slavery and racism because that dominated that particular period. Or you could walk in and think, oh my God, another woke, class, because, somewhere along the lines, you got the idea that this was something that was like that it wasn't so much that this stuff didn't happen, but it really shouldn't occupy like a prominent place in an American history course. Either way, you're dealing with the politics of history. Now, let me shift back to Robert E. Lee. This is the Virginia Memorial. If you go to Gettysburg National Military Park, and you really should, it is it's a tremendous place to go to. I've been there more times than I can count. I've done historical tours of the battlefield. They're called staff rides, and they're a combination of tour and discussion um, of perennial issues, face of command, logistics, strategic decision making, and so forth. These they're called staff rides, and these are primarily for military officers, for the education of military officers. Sometimes, though, I've had civilian business managers go on these same staff rides, and the the historical tour is the same, but the what we discuss has to do with business management principles more than military principles. But anyway, the Virginia Memorial was the first memorial that was legally placed on the Gettysburg National Military Park, which in those days was still owned by the War Department, it hadn't been turned over to the National Park Service yet. And up until then, this was the scene of a Union victory, and there was a military cemetery there where the Union dead had been buried, and here is where Lincoln had given his Gettysburg address. And although Confederate monuments and memorials were welcome on other battlefields farther to the south, they were excluded from the Gettysburg battlefield until 1917. Well, why was this? Well, in part, it had to do with the passage of time, but in part, it had to do with Robert E. Lee having become not a Confederate hero anymore, but a national hero. Why was this? Well, I talked about this memory of the Civil War as being one of you know, Americans on the northern side and the southern side fighting for different but morally equivalent visions of the American Republic, the American future. And whatever you might think about the historical accuracy of this, from a public memory standpoint, this interpretation of the Civil War played a significant role in hastening the reconciliation of the North and the South. So that by the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, the surviving Union veterans and Confederate veterans, Union veterans on the left here, Confederate veterans on the right, they came to an encampment, happened went over several days in July of 1913. And one of the things they did was the Confederates actually did a kind of a charge, their own Pickett's reenactment of Pickett's charge, and they reached the objective point of Pickett's charge, which is right here. And there's a stone wall in between them. It's overgrown at this point with ivy and other kinds of things. And when they reached the stone wall, rather than fighting hand to hand and so forth, the Union and Confederate veterans clasped hands to show that the Republic is once again united. We're all Americans again. Okay? And so Robert E. Lee becomes a symbol of this national memory of the American Civil War as one of equal valor on both sides, so that uh, there is a postage stamp that's issued based on a famous photograph of Robert E. Lee, and it was in circulation between 1954 and 1968. There was a ballistic missile submarine. This is to say, a submarine that carried nuclear rockets, Polaris missiles. They were called. They were called. And this submarine was commissioned in 1960, named Robert E. Lee. Was in service until 1983. Well, in the early 2000s, this version of American history that both Northern Americans and Southern Americans had fought for, different but morally equivalent views of the American Republic. This became very heavily challenged. And academic historians had rejected it many years before. I mean, they were reality based. They could read the ordinances of secession. They could read the justifications for it. They could read the letters that Confederate delegates sent to states that had not yet seceded, saying, "Hey, look, what's at stake here is the preservation of slavery. If African Americans are no longer enslaved, you're going to have all kinds of negative consequences, interracial war, and also miscegenation, mixing between the two races, which was like the nightmare scenario if you were a white supremacist." In 2017, there was uh, protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, over the presence of this particular statue of Robert E. Lee. In Charlottesville, Virginia, there was also a statue of Stonewall Jackson. And you'll notice that this statue of Robert E. Lee was erected in 1924. And if you visited Charlotte, Virginia, what you would find is that both the statue of Robert E. Lee and the statue of Stonewall Jackson were facing toward the predominantly African American communities of part of African American part of town in Charlottesville, and it was really a, a silent way of reinforcing that we white Southerners are in a position of political and economic and social dominance over you African Americans, and don't forget it. And if you um, read the speeches of dedication of these two statues, they make this white supremacy issue. It is most prominent. It is prominent and so forth. And so when people talk about taking down these statues, you're erasing history. Well, you are in the sense of erasing a history that takes place in 1924, or you're removing an artifact that has to do with with white supremacy. And you can imagine from the standpoint of being an African American father. I'm the father of a 13-year-old daughter. Um, let's say that we walked through the park where these two statues are located. Let's say my daughter is a bit younger. Let's say she's 4 or 5 years old, and she sees this man on horseback, and he looks resplendent and so forth. And I ask, and she asks me, and again, I'm an African American father. What is that man doing on horseback? He looks like he looks heroic. Tell me about him, Daddy. And then I, as an African American father, would either have to kind of like change the subject, or I would have to tell her, well, this was a general who fought for a country that briefly existed, and this country came into existence, was part of the United States of America, and it came into existence briefly in order to keep our ancestors in chains. So, did that statue have a place in 2017 America? Many argued no, but others argued that it was a sort of reverse racism to take these statues down, and some of them, really um, explicitly embraced the idea that this was about white supremacy, and that white should continue to be in charge. And during a nighttime parade around this time, you had a number of these people carrying tiki torches, and saying either the way you could hear it is, "You will not replace us," meaning African Americans or Hispanic Americans, or indigenous peoples, or Jews will not replace us, because this particular group was also notoriously anti-Semitic. As many of you will remember, in 2020, an African American man named George Ferguson was murdered, really, by a police officer in Minneapolis, and we wouldn't know this except for all the video evidence that was presented. And he was tried before a jury for this murder and convicted of it. And the George Ferguson, the the murder of this African American man spurred protests all over the country. And What? I'm sorry, it's not George Ferguson. It's George Floyd. Just blank on. There's a Ferguson, Missouri, where some stuff happened, and anyway, um, in Richmond, Virginia, on Monument Avenue in 2022. This is what the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, a place called Monument Avenue. This is what it looked like, and it had been, put, graffiti had been put all over it and so forth. And in effect, this, this General Robert E. Lee was now considered to be a symbol of racism and oppression. And this statue has since come down. So we have history, we have public memory, and then we have something that I like to think of as being personal memory or private memory. That's me. I think I'm in the seventh grade there, and if you notice, my teeth haven't been corrected yet in this photograph, and I got picked on a lot because of that, and for other things. I was smaller than other kids and younger than other kids, and so on. And so I retreated, into the world of the Civil War. Read a lot of books on the Civil War and so forth. And actually, even earlier than this, when I was 8 years old, I read a biography of Robert E. Lee called Robert E. Lee and the Road of Honor by Harding Carter, who, by the way, was a Mississippi newspaper editor who was an outspoken proponent of civil rights for African Americans and had all kinds of death threats and so on, but nonetheless regarded Robert E. Lee as a hero. And Robert E. Lee became someone that I personally admired a great deal for the values that I understood Lee to represent and the kind of character that I saw Lee as having as well. And I think sometimes people have a personal memory of their ancestors, Confederate soldiers, or of a Confederate general or Confederate generals that mean something to them. And I think that they realize that they believe that as the public memory of the Confederacy changes, that this means that they have to give up their personal image of the Confederacy or the Confederate veterans, their Confederate ancestors, or of Robert E. Lee, that they have to give this up personally. And I don't think they do. I think that they can choose to admire pretty much whoever they want, as long as they don't attempt to impose this insistence on admiration, upon other people, a broader society, and so on. One of the things that I make um, apparent in my courses sooner rather than later is that I have bipolar disorder. I was formally diagnosed with it in 1926. It's a serious mood disorder. It has to do with an abnormality in the brain chemistry. And Robert E. Lee's determination to fight on in the face of forbidding numerical odds against the Union Army, resonates with me even today because I'm engaged in this struggle against a serious mental illness, that carries with it a risk of suicide that is between 10 and 30 times that of the general population. So this is a disorder that has literally lethal potential. And so I do everything I can to keep this disorder at bay. I take medication. I see a therapist. I try to eat right. Um, Try to exercise. Try to maintain a connected life, and so forth. All the things that maximize my chances of surviving this disorder. And my admiration for Robert E. Lee is sort of is part of this. Um, you know, Robert E. Lee's stoicism, his resilience in the face of of sort of forbidding odds, and so on. And this here are the final uh, stanzas of a poem. It comes out of a book-length poem by Stephen Vincent Benet. It's called John Brown's Body, published in 1928. And these are the final lines of a long poem that he did about General Robert E. Lee from the perspective of a staff officer who sees Lee inside his headquarters tent on a summer night in the in the summer of 1864, when Confederate fortunes are beginning to flag and Lee's army is beginning to suffer significant defeats from which it looks like it's not going to recover. And yet, Lee continues, valiantly to lead the army and to do the best that he can to keep the Union Army at bay, and so on. So here's the final lines. And when I first encountered them, it was in reading this poem in my sophomore English class. I was just sort of asked to read it. I didn't know what I was going to be reading when I started it out, and I began with that kind of mechanical, not too emotional, reading, because you don't want your the other students like snickering at you. And very quickly, sort of got lost in the poem, and I could hear other students, snickering, and I could hear the teacher saying shh, trying to stop them. I didn't care because the poem had an emotional grip on me then and still does. So here are the lines. You see the faces of spear handling kings in the old books they taught us from at school. Big Agamemnon with his curly beard, Achilles in the cruelty of his youth, and Oedipus before he tore his eyes. These are mostly references to the Iliad. The Oedipus is related to another Greek tragedy. And then I'd like to see him in that chariot rank. I'd like to see Lee in that chariot rank with Traveler, that was uh, Lee's favorite horse, pulling at the leader pole. I don't think when the winged claws come down, they'll get a groan from him. So we go on under the claws, and he goes on ahead. And this this image of going on under the claws means something to me, because every day of my life I am, in a sense, under the claws, of this serious, mental illness that eventually might attack in such a way that I cannot defeat it. So in that way, in terms of personal memory, this is something that I hold on to, and I believe that I have a right to hold on to it. So we have three kinds of history here. We have history that you can argue about and that you can evaluate critically, and that involves sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. There is history as public memory or celebratory, history that is a dominant memory that tells us who we are as a society, and that in a country consisting of 330 million people, there can be attempts to change this public memory. But whoever is comfortable with the existing public memory is going to resist attempts to change it. In the early 1960s, a literary figure, great novelist, writer of essays, and so on, a guy named James Baldwin, who was born in 1924, died in 1987. In 1963, he wrote an essay, and it was for his brother. Oh, sorry, it's for his nephew, a younger nephew. And he was saying, things are changing now, and what you're going to come up against is the hostility, the hatred of white Americans who are not going to want you to succeed, who are going to want you to remain in the same subordinate position that African Americans have been in, even since emancipation. And the essay, which comes from a book called The Fire Next Time, which sounds like it's going to be very angry and so forth, is is really poignant and gentle and tender, in tone, and basically insists that his nephew must have compassion, for these whites who are going to insist upon, that you don't belong in a position that's as good as ours. You belong in a subordinate position. And he says, this is what these people are going through. Try to imagine how you would feel If you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and yet all the stars aflame, you would be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundation. A couple of years after that, James Baldwin was invited to Cambridge University. Every year they would have a famous debate, and his debating opponent was a prominent conservative named William F. Buckley, who was the founder of the National Review and actually a very important figure in terms of the revival of um, conservatism, which had been pushed to really the margins of American political life. There was an idea that sort of liberalism had triumphed, and even Republicans were now part of an order that accepted the New Deal, that accepted the idea of big government that protected all Americans and regulated big business and so forth. And Buckley was part of the conservative movement that was trying to push back against that. So Buckley had already been invited to this thing. The organizers discovered that James Baldwin was in Switzerland, and so they flew him into Cambridge, and they had this debate. And the the proposition for debate was resolved: the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. And James Baldwin, of course, was asked to argue in the affirmative: the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. And then Buckley was obviously going to argue the negative on this. And actually, Buckley did not come terribly well prepared for this. He was someone who fathomed himself to be a great intellectual, like could just sort of talk off the top of his head, and and successfully. And he was, by the way, a smart man. Wrote a number of books and and so on, and was very articulate, so on. But he wasn't prepared to deal with James Baldwin. And after this lecture presentation, there's going to be about an 8 minute excerpt from this debate in which James Baldwin talks about sort of this is at the heart of why the American dream does come at the expense of the Negro, and something that he emphasizes is the absence of African Americans, from history. The idea that they had no history, the idea that they were barbarous, the idea that they were savage, and so on. Baldwin talks about this, and this is often called the pin drop speech because the hall where this debate was taking place was already overcrowded. It had about 700 people in it, and everybody was just absolutely silent while they heard James Baldwin speak. And at the end of this debate, Baldwin's inside, won handily, by several times in terms of voting over the number of votes that Buckley's position received. This is a photograph of my grandfather. This is on my mother's side. My grandfather, Tom Harvin, and his wife Margaret Griffin Harvin. You can see them all the way to the right. And this was taken at a picnic that my grandfather. And by the way, he was the grandson of the Harvin that I mentioned earlier, who owned the plantation and subsequently controlled the labor of 20 freed people in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. He was his grandson, and Tom Harvin, my grandfather, at that point controlled the labor of tenant farmers, quite a few of them. And these were people who worked in a mostly sharecropping environment. Uh, they worked for him. They got a share of the crop and so forth, and he got a substantial share of the crop. And he prospered from this arrangement. And they, for reasons of legal segregation, this is in North Carolina in the 1950s. You don't get desegregation in North Carolina, which, by the way, is where I grew up, until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and you still saw a great deal of racism after that. But anyway, this is a photograph of him as kind of like sort of the paternalistic figure who kind of psychologically or socially or whatever sort of dominates the rest of these people. And he's giving them a picnic out of the goodness of his heart, and they're looking at the camera. And you might think that I, as a white person, and particularly a lineal descendant of a slaveholder and a man who controlled tenant farmers and so forth, would feel guilty about this. I don't, but it's part of my history, and I'm not afraid to face this as part of my history, and also to understand that a significant part of my grandfather's wealth came from the wealth generated by the labor of the African Americans who worked for his grandfather, and that a lot of the value of the farms that my grandfather owned, and there was more than one, came from the labor of these tenant farmers. So I benefited indirectly from the wealth that my grandfather had, who enabled him to raise my mother and her brothers and sisters um, in reasonably prosperous circumstances. And I owe, in effect, these people a direct debt, because after my mother passed away, and my grandfather passed away, and then my mother passed away, these farms were sold, and I received a significant chunk of the proceeds from the sale of those farms, and my share of the proceeds underwrote the price of me going to London uh, for a year to get my master's degree. So I was able to live abroad in London for a year. Was able to go to Africa and visit Kenya and what was then called Zaire for a couple of months. I was able to visit France and Switzerland and so on. And this was all based partly on my savings. I worked hard. I started working when I was in high school, and I worked my way through college and so forth. So some of the money was mine, but a significant part of amount of it came from the wealth generated, um, in no small measure by these people. Do I feel guilty about that? No, I don't feel guilty about that, but I'm not afraid to face it. I'm not afraid to recognize it. Um, and I think that's important. And I think that I would be less of a man than I am if somehow or other I were too sort of fragile to accept these as part of the reality of my personal past. Okay, I'm on the home stretch now. I've got a couple other things to have you look at. There are, these are the two textbooks or that I used actually some years ago. I gave my students a choice between using one or the other. Um, and the American People Creating a Nation and a Society is roughly the same as the American Yawp, the free textbook that you'll be using for this course. But from an optional standpoint, if you want to, you can purchase this other textbook. It's called A Patriot's History of the United States, and it's by two bona fide academic historians who really thought that most American history textbooks had gone too far in the direction really away from political history. That was an important part of their critique, to social history and cultural history and so on. And they published their book as A Patriot's History of the United States, which is kind of tendentious because it implies that anybody who didn't agree with their interpretation of history was not patriotic. But anyway, um, radio talk show host Glenn Beck got a hold of this thing and told his listening audience about it, and it became a New York Times bestseller. And thereafter, the two authors sort of played very heavily into sort of the culture wars aspect of the political scene, because they saw on which side their butter was their bread was buttered. It's nonetheless responsibly done history. And if you want to buy this book, and you can buy it inexpensively, and use it in addition to the American Yawp or use it for comparative purposes or whatever, I encourage you to do so. You'll get a different interpretation of American history, but it doesn't like it doesn't rewrite American history, in some kind of horrible, sort of way that, slavery was good for African Americans or something along those kinds of lines. It sort of accentuates the positive, you might say, and deals with political history, which in the nature of the case deals with mostly with elites and so on. But it's a perfectly serviceable, one might say, conservative view of American history. And then finally, there is the idea of history that gets forgotten and kind of gets forgotten on purpose. This is General Jean Jacques Dessalines. He was a general on what was the French colony of Saint Domingue, which is on the western third of the island of Hispaniola. It's where Haiti is now. There was a tremendous slave uprising there in 1791, in which the French planter class was wiped out. And this was a very important wealth producing colony for France because a tremendous amount of sugar was produced there, and Europe had an insatiable demand for sugar. And unlike the United States, where African Americans tended to survive long enough to have to have children, so that the population grew over time, in on this in this French colony and other British and French and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, you had this constant flow of new enslaved people from Africa because the life expectancy in this colony, Saint Domingue, was about 2 years, and then you would die from disease and other kinds of things. Well, in the wake of this slave uprising, a free black named Toussaint Louverture kind of took control of it because these enslaved people sort of didn't know what to do next once they had eradicated the French planter population, and he organized them into a society and eventually fought against an attempt by Napoleonic France to restore slavery, which during the French Revolution, the revolutionaries had said, we're not going to have slavery anymore. Napoleon's like, yes, you are. And he sent an expeditionary force of 30,000 troops to what was now being called Haiti, um, to recover control over that sugar producing colony. And this Haitian general, Dessalines, eradicated that 30,000 man expeditionary force almost to the last man, sometimes through violence, sometimes because of disease and so forth that struck this 30,000 man expeditionary force. But Dessalines made it certain that Haiti would become its own country, and it became a republic. The first African American republic in the world, and only the second republic in the Western Hemisphere. So, and then finally, there's a really interesting book that I might introduce you to later on. It's called Silencing the Past: Power and the Production of History. And it's by a man, Trujillo, excuse me, who taught at the University of Chicago, but had grown up in Africa and also in Haiti, and talks about instances in which history gets sort of deliberately silenced, so that this episode that I just told you about, which should be one of the great stories in world history, is so far in the background that most people have just never heard of it at all. And Trio, um, argues that this is not an accident. This was done on purpose, and he talks about why this was done and how this was done, and so on. And so this is one last example of the politics of history.